values clarification was also something that was going to be very important to focus on early in treatment. Essentially, we are having this client engage in a number of exercises that are essentially putting him in contact with things that he fears. And we want the client to recognize that this is in service of something greater, that this exposure work is in service of him being able to circumvent those internal barriers and external barriers to living the life that he wants to live. The client did, fortunately, already have some awareness of what his values were. The problem here was that the client's primary way of connecting with his values was through his work. And given that he was on leave, it made it a bit more challenging for him to identify activities that he could engage in that would be consistent with his values. So we had him engage in a number of different exercises to help clarify what his values were. One exercise was a Freewriting, where essentially he was to imagine as though he could remove all of the barriers, all the things that were challenging or difficult to him. If he could get away from his anxiety, thoughts, what would he choose to do with his time? What would he want his life to look like? And from there, we could identify what were the things that were driving the choices that he made. And that's where we were able to clarify what some of his values were. Another exercise was having him imagine if someone was going to write a book about him 100 years from now, what would you want them to say about you? What would you want them to say that your life stood for? And in doing that, we were able to identify what the client's values were. And then we could use that essentially as a guide for actions that he could take each week. So each week throughout treatment, Mark was asked to identify valued actions, and they didn't have to be anything major. They could be something very small. And in some ways, it's better if they were smaller actions, because the idea is that we want the client to be able to identify a number of different activities that can easily be folded into their everyday life. And in some ways, these might even be activities that Mark was already engaged in, but we wanted to bring awareness to those activities. And the idea here is that the client could use these values as essentially as a guide for his behavior, as opposed to the avoidance that he was engaging in. So in those moments where Mark encountered something that he feared, something that brought up painful memories of the traumatic event, Mark could ask himself, is this action in service of my values, or is this action in service of avoidance? And the idea is that we wanted him to focus on values as a guide for his behavior. In addition, in terms of values clarification, we also found a way that we could use the pain that he was experiencing as a way of clarifying kind of what his values were. The fact that the client was experiencing such pain and even shame and guilt as a result of not being able to save the individual who had the motor vehicle accident, we could use as an indication that this was something that truly mattered to him. Because otherwise, we wouldn't expect there would be such a strong emotional response. So, for example, if he's experiencing shame, it was an indication that this was something that he was not able to accomplish, that he wanted to help this individual, but he was unable to do so. And as a result, is experiencing this shame and guilt. So we could use that pain almost as a way of helping us clarify his values. It provides us with information as to what matters in his life. We also were looking at ways in which we could use his emotions as guides for which valued actions to take. So for example, if he was experiencing shame, which is not a particularly helpful emotion, well, could he then use as an opportunity to focus on values that were centered around caring for himself? So in some ways, we're almost doing kind of an opposite action that you would see in dialectical behavior therapy. As he's essentially acting opposite the urge associated with that shame response, which is to hide, isolate, avoid. In addition, we wanted to identify some in vivo exposure exercises that were kind of centered around these valued actions. So instead of having him go into situations that were associated with that traumatic event, instead, we wanted him to identify valued actions that may actually put him into contact with things that he has feared or that he would like to avoid, so that he can engage in these valued actions, can increase the extent to which he's doing things that are meaningful to him, and yet at the same time doing an exposure exercise.